The title of today's message for me is called The Secret to Walking with God. The Secret to Walking with God. I love how the young Year 6 students graduated, because I was reminded of when I was in youth. The youth kids have this common saying. It's called the spiritual high. Okay? And so what I mean by that phrase is we would go to youth camps, conferences, and spend a few days solely focused on God. And would leave that camp or conference spiritually high. Like, we can sense God's presence. God's love for me feels so much more real. And I feel close to Him. But then after a few weeks pass, you go to school, you start doing the things you usually do, and surprise, surprise, the spiritual high suddenly turned into a spiritual desert. And you don't feel close to God anymore. You feel distant to God, and you don't know what's happened. Where did that fire for God that I experienced at that camp or in that moment or experience disappeared? You know, it's not an experience that only youth students experience. It's a common shared experience for every single one of us here. If you've come to church for a while, if you've had a relationship with God, you know what it feels like to at one point be so close to God and intimate with Him, but somewhere along the line you find yourself drifted away, and the spiritual high you felt, the overflow that you experienced is nowhere to be seen, and it just feels so dry, so stagnant, right? And so what do as Christians? We try harder. We try harder to become a better Christian. We try harder to feel that experience of intimacy again. So you come to Sunday, you attend church, you feel touched by the Holy Spirit, by the sermon and the service, and then you wake up on Monday morning, you open up your dusty Bible, and you look at, somehow you turn to the Old Testament in Leviticus, and it doesn't make sense, but you're trying. You just try it. You try and pray. You try and put some worship music on the way to work, and then Wednesday hits and you feel distant to God again. Many of us can relate to this struggle. Trying and trying, but you're still in the same spiritual ruts. Same cycles of behavior. Same patterns. It's almost like driving a car its wheels are just misaligned. And you try and try to steer it back into a straight line, but as soon as you put your hands off that steering wheel, it veers off again. That's what a lot of us feel when it comes to our relationship with God. We ask ourselves, what am I doing wrong? I'm trying my best. I desire the Christian life that the preacher talks about. What's going on? Where is God in the midst of it? Does He even see the efforts that I'm putting in? You know, I share this because I know what that feels like. You know, I used to struggle with rage and anger. You know, none of you have seen that before, back in the days, right? And I remember when I was in those ruts and those patterns, I was just so hopeless because, Lord, I'm trying so hard to be a better person, to be a kind, loving person, but no matter how hard I try, nothing changes. I just come back to the same old cycle. Where is this transformation that they always talk about? Where is this change, that power that changes us and raises us up from the dead? Gone. But then I began to discover the secret to walking with God. A secret that allowed me to catch a glimpse and experience of the possibility of transformation. A secret that freed me from something that I never thought I'd be free from. I thought I'd just be this angry, unself-controlled person for the rest of my life. But then when I discovered this secret, God just began in His grace to heal, to mend, restore, and transform. Change began to occur in my life, not because I was trying harder, but because I began learning about this secret. Before I unpack that secret, I do want to touch on some assumptions that we carry in our relationship with God. The reason why I want to touch on assumptions is because assumptions have so much power for our Christian life and experience. Every single one of us here have assumptions. You have an assumption about the person sitting next to you. Ooh. Now it's getting a bit awkward. We have assumptions of me standing up here. We have assumptions about that phone call, right? All of us carry assumptions. But most importantly, we all have assumptions about God. Maybe some of us have assumptions that God is a harsh God who is strict with us. Maybe some of you have an assumption that God is actually a loving God. Dallas Willard says, we have it up on the screen, we live at the mercy of our ideas. Those who operate on wrong information are likely never to know the reality of God's presence in the decisions which shape their lives and will miss the constant divine companionship for which their souls were made for. In other words, our assumptions shape our expectations, which in turn shape our experience. Even in the research in social psychology, reveals to us that expectations influences our experience. Why? Because if you assume that God is a distant God, you will very much likely not go to Him, not draw near to Him. If you believe that God is a harsh and strict God, you will struggle to boldly come to Him with all your struggles and flaws. If you assume that God is silent, you most likely won't keep an attentive ear to hear His voice. But in contrast, if you have the assumption that God is a gracious God, that He's a loving God, your expectations will begin to change. And when you begin to expect a God who loves you, expect a God who speaks to you, the experience will validate your assumptions. And that's how assumptions become faith. That's how assumptions become reality for us. Assumptions shape our relationship with God. And one of the most common questions we often ask as Christians is, does God really care about me that much? Is the God of this universe really invested and interested and caring about the most trivial things in my life? When I do my laundry, when I go for a run, when I'm talking to that friend at a cafe, is He really that intimately invested? And does He really speak to me in every moment? We have these deep, doubt-filled questions. And the Bible shouts to us an emphatic yes to that. If you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to turn to Psalm 139, verse 1 to 18. I'll give us a few seconds. Otherwise, you can hear my paraphrase, the Noah Kim paraphrase. Psalm 139 says, even though God is not physically here with you, He knows every single thought you're thinking. He knows everything you're going to say before it is even on your tongue. That you are never out of His sight. That He is watching over you, not as a police officer or as someone who's willing or waiting to judge you, but as someone who is a loving Father. He knows you're coming and going. There is not a single place you can go where He will not be with you. You can try and hide from Him. Go to the depths and He will be there with you. So why does He care so much about you and I? Why is He so invested in us and know us so intimately? Because He's the one who actually designed each and every one of us here. He's the one who crafted us and shaped us in our mother's womb. Like if you just imagine this imagery and metaphor, if you see a pregnant lady, just imagine within that womb, God is shaping and crafting and creating His designed beautiful human being. That's why He knows us so intimately. And I love how this psalm never portrays God's love and intimate knowing of us based on performance, but based on creation, based on our inherent value. It goes against the grain of what this world preaches at us, which is you've got to earn it all. We see here a God who just so intimately loves us. You know, some of us may think when we read a psalm like this, oh, it's just a poem. It's just a nice, eloquent poem with nice words. But what we find in this psalm is that this psalmist is writing from his real, first-hand experience of this intimate knowing. So much so that he's overwhelmed. He can't even grasp that this reality is real. You know, I don't cry often, but when I do, it's quite often when I'm in the presence of God, when I'm meditating on His words, and when I'm reminded of just how well He knows me, yet He loves me. Does God's love for you overwhelm you? Like, I wonder if so many of our lack in our life, the problems in our life, the fears, the anxiety, the dissatisfaction would be resolved if we truly come to grasp this truth. But this psalmist didn't just know this truth based on information, but he knew this truth based on experience. It was a real thing that was just flowing in his life that he couldn't help but write these words. If we can only experience what this psalmist is experiencing, the kind of life we could live, how transformative it would be. And the psalmist's response to all of this in verse 14 is, I praise you, I rejoice in you, because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your words, your works are wonderful. In verse 17 to 18, your thoughts, how rare, how beautiful. God, I'll never comprehend them. I couldn't even begin to count them any more than I could count the sand of the sea. Oh, let me rise in the morning and live always with you. You see how the response of the psalmist to this intimate knowing of God is, I will wake up each morning and I rejoice in you. I celebrate that you know me so deeply. When we begin to realize and experience that God delights in us and intimately knows us, the natural response of that experiential knowledge is to wake up each morning and to celebrate in that joy. It's to rejoice. You cannot enjoy a person's presence if you know that they hate you. There is not a single person here who can confidently say that you've enjoyed the presence of someone who you know is against you. Not a single one of us. That's why this truth is so important for us. To know this truth, but not only to know, but to experience it for ourselves. Do you know this truth for yourself? That He intimately knows you and cares about you. And this is exactly the secret that I will be unraveling this morning, which is the secret to walking with God is to learn to enjoy the presence of God. We weren't made to try harder our way into heaven. We weren't made to strive into eternity and into relationship with God. Just trying to love someone better, just trying to be more gracious, to be less angry, to be less jealous, to be less impatient, simply doesn't work because that's not what we were created to do in the first place. Instead, we were created to enjoy the presence of God. How about you turn to the person next to you and say, you were created to enjoy the presence of God. Amen. John Eldridge, an author, writes this: intimacy with God is the purpose of our lives. It's why God created us, not simply to believe in Him, though that is a good beginning. Not only to obey Him, though that is a higher life still. That intimacy with God is the very purpose of our life. In the 1640s in England, pastors and theologians gathered. And that gathering was called the Westminster Assembly. And basically they were defending their faith, solidifying their faith and the doctrines. And from there came something called the Westminster Catechism. Catechism is basically a mode of teaching in the form of questions and answers. And maybe some of you know of this, but one of the most famous questions asked in this catechism was, what is the chief end of man? What is the ultimate purpose of man? What is the reason for the existence of man? And I love this answer, that man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Another pastor, who I don't fully agree with at all times, yet though he stands in a different position, he also agrees God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him. So no matter what tradition you're from, no matter what ideology you have, the truth stands firm, which is, it's undeniable that we were created to enjoy the presence of God. Psalm 34 says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Leah mentioned that. 1 Peter says, you believe in Him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy. John 17 says that eternal life is to intimately know this person who is Jesus Christ. Philippians chapter 4 says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Psalm 73, whom do I have in heaven but you? And with you I desire nothing on earth. I'm satisfied sufficiently with your presence alone, so much so that I don't need anything else. Psalm 16 says, you will make known to me the way of life, and in your presence is the fullness of joy. Not a little bit of joy, not a joy for Monday morning and a week, but fullness of joy. And your right hand, there are pleasures forever. These are people who are enjoying God's presence and who are speaking from that enjoyment. The purpose of our existence is to enjoy Him. And I love how God is most glorified when we enjoy His presence. You know how ironic it would be for a Christian who says, I believe in a loving Father. I believe in a God who has abundant grace like no other. Yet they live their life miserably without an ounce of enjoyment and joy. You know how paradoxical that is? But you know someone truly believes in the real love and grace of God when you look at their life and you see their enjoyment, their satisfaction, their pleasure, not in anything else but in the presence of God. We were created to enjoy the presence of God. That's the secret. I'm going to go home now. Not yet. I still got 2 more points. It's the key to living a life that is constantly transformed. It's the key from finding freedom from the spiritual ruts that many of us struggle in. To find what we cannot find by simply trying harder. That leads me to my second point, which is that God shapes the roots before producing the fruits. That was a good rhyme. Luke chapter 19, verse 5 to 8 says, this is a story of Zacchaeus, tax collector. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So this tax collector, he came down at once and welcomed Jesus into his home gladly. And all the people saw this and they began to mutter. They began to complain. Jesus, this so-called Messiah, Rabbi, has gone to associate with a tax collector. Someone who all of us despise, a sinner. But then Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Who was Zacchaeus? In the biblical times, they called him a tax collector, but in our modern equivalent, he's a person who exploited the government's corruption against his own people. These are the people that we'll see on the news, and you'd be fuming at them. These are the people who are taking advantage of the poor and the people who are financially illiterate, exploiting it just for his selfish gain. Not only that, he's the one who betrayed his own people. Being Jewish, he took the side of the Roman government and turned against his own people. That's why people despised him so much. He did some very terrible things. But you know what? I love how Jesus, his first words in encounter with Zacchaeus is not, do not steal. It's not, do not sin. It's not, do not do that anymore. Do you know what the first words of Jesus is? It says, I must stay at your house. That I must come into your life. You know, the biblical idea of God entering a house also symbolizes God entering into the heart of someone, God entering into the deepest crevices of someone's soul. Proverbs 24 says, by wisdom a house is built. It doesn't mean wisdom's going to build a literal home, but it's saying that it's building a human life. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 says, you are God's temple. It's not saying that you and I are literal infrastructure. It means that we are the people in which God is dwelling in. I stand at the door and knock, not on a wooden door, but at the door of our hearts. So when Jesus enters the house of Zacchaeus, he is also entering into the very heart of Zacchaeus, where the dirt and the mess and the sin resides. And we know this because Jesus ends with saying, today, salvation has come to this house. A house cannot be saved, right? But it was Zacchaeus, the heart in which he entered, that experienced salvation. You know, the reason I share this point in this story of Zacchaeus is because Jesus was not interested in modifying the behavior of Zacchaeus. Tell me from that story alone a single moment that Jesus corrects the behavior of Zacchaeus. Tell me a single moment where he looks at the prostitute who's crying at his feet, pouring out perfume. A single moment where he condemns her for her sin. You know why? Because Jesus is not interested in modifying your behavior. But I wonder, so many of us who have been Christians for a while, you've lived your whole faith journey trying to modify your behavior, trying to be a better Christian, trying to do this and that, but you know that it's to no success. Because modifying behavior cannot transform the heart. Sure, you can make the branches look nice, but if the roots are not transformed, all that it will produce is sin. That's why Jesus says that a good tree cannot help but bear good fruit. That's why he says a bad tree cannot help but bear bad fruit. So maybe as we reflect on our own iniquities, the own patterns in your life, the own ruts and cycles in your life, let me ask you, what is Jesus' voice in the midst of that? Because I'm quite confident that it's not, stop doing that anymore. Stop sinning. Stop being angry. Stop being frustrated. But it's actually, Noah, I must enter your house today. I know that what you need is not behavior modification, but what you need is my presence. I know that if you would just spend time with me, be saturated in my love, that your roots will be cleansed, that he will enter into the parts of our house that are unclean, the parts of our house that is filled with patterns and cycles that you are ashamed of. But if you would just be saturated in the presence of God, and as our roots become transformed, our behavior, our lifestyle cannot help but conform to the Christ-like character that is being formed in us. Before Zacchaeus' behavior was changed, he was seen, he was called by name, and he was welcomed. And I love how his behavior did in fact change. That we do in fact see the fruit. I'm wondering what happened before verse 9, verse 8, where Zacchaeus decides to sell all his possessions and give it back to the poor and pay back what he has stole. I wonder what has happened between there and his encounter with Jesus. What must have happened in that house for him to have this kind of transformation? Can I tell you, it wasn't a seminar. It wasn't a conference. It wasn't a book, but it was sitting at the feet of Jesus, saturating and experiencing his presence, being glad in his presence. And before you know it, Zacchaeus cannot help but say, look, he's not obligated to do this. He's not forced to give his wealth, but he cannot help because he's experienced something better. He's enjoyed and delighted, and he's found satisfaction in something that's greater than the wealth he's been chasing all his life. So the secret to walking with God for us, it's not trying not to sin. It's not trying to be better and trying harder, but it's to sit at the feet of Jesus each day, each moment, when you're in the train, when you're at work, so much so that your fruit just produces Christ-likeness. You know, I remember in high school, I went to counseling to Pastor Ray. I had behaviors I wanted to fix. And I remember I went to him and I told him all the behaviors, all the cycles and patterns that I hated and I wanted to get out of. But for the next 8 weeks, Pastor Ray didn't even talk about a single behavior I mentioned. And I remember I was so frustrated at Pastor Ray. Like, I came to you for you to fix my behavior. I didn't say it that way. That's my internal. But then he didn't mention a single thing about my behavior. You know what he did mention? How to experience the love of God deeper. How to know him. I'm wondering if we would just know him, how we would experience the freedom. Because I feel for those people who are in the ruts of your same old behavior, your same old life, and you're just trying harder. That's not the gospel. I don't believe in a gospel that cannot transform us. I believe in a gospel that has the power that saved Jesus Christ from the dead. And that power lives in us. That is the gospel. That's the gospel that we preach. I don't believe in a cheap gospel that says all you got to do is just believe and you go to heaven and that's all. And that's the kind of life that God invites you and I to. A life where we can really become like Christ. Not because we can do it, but because his grace is just that sufficient. Jesus is not interested in fixing your behavior. He's interested in entering into your house and purifying that just with his unconditional love. Some of us need that today. Some of us need the presence of God more than anything. For your marriage, for your relationships, for your struggles, your anxieties. He seeks to enter your house. I told you I cry when I'm in the presence of God. But it doesn't happen automatically for us, right? It happens as a process. It's something we learn. And that's my third point, and I want to end on this, that enjoying God's presence is something we learn. It takes time. It takes practice. I think this is so encouraging because I see the musicians playing. Jericho playing the guitar, Kuya Jono playing the piano, Kuya Lou playing everything. Kuya Net playing the drums, Praj, Sam. You know, I look at them and I see them when they're worshiping with their instruments. They're just saturated with joy. They're enjoying the instruments that they're playing. But did you know that they didn't start out enjoying it from the very beginning? They began with that unnatural, uncomfortable, awkward stage in the start where you're trying to get the hang of this instrument, but it's very awkward. You don't get the hang of it, but you just keep going. You wake up another day and you're, all right, let me try this again. And then what happens over time and what happens over practice is the instrument that once felt so awkward and unnatural starts to feel a lot more smoother and natural. Not only that, eventually it becomes enjoyable. It becomes something that you can find joy and satisfaction in. So it is with our relationship with God, our spiritual formation. Many of us, or some of us here, you'll leave after hearing this sermon. You're going to open up the Bible. You're going to try pray. You're going to try and do the Christian practices. And I'll tell you, more often than not, it will feel unnatural. It'll feel uncomfortable. But then as you practice, as you give yourself time to grow, you'll begin to taste a little bit more of His peace. You'll begin to experience a bit more of His love in a deeper way, where it's not just belief, but now it's experience. You'll begin to notice over some time, over some months, being saturated in the presence of God, that you're no longer reacting out of anger. You're not even trying to not be angry anymore, but you don't feel the anger anymore. Why? Because your behavior and lifestyle has been conformed to the Christ-like character in you. I believe there is a way, and it's not really a secret. I believe there is a way for freedom. This is a working theory of change. It's not just Christian language trying to make things look nice and sound nice, but this is a real, practical, working theory of change that can free you and I, that saves us. To give yourself time and let your practice take its place. But the good news is that we don't have to do it alone. We have the blessing of ministries like young adults, youth ministry, cell groups. And there are some of us here who aren't connected and rooted in that. But I really deeply encourage you. Participate in that community. Learn from the people who are already on that journey. Learn the practices that we are learning, not just for the sake of it, but with the goal and aim to enjoy the presence of God. So I encourage you, if you're not connected, come to the front after the service and we'll get you connected. There's a phrase that says, give a person a fish to eat and he'll eat for a day. But teach him how to fish and he'll eat for the rest of his life. I believe that's what our aim and goal is. It's not to feed us with fish each day, each Sunday, just to feed us for 1 week. It's to teach us and to train us and develop us into Christians who can experience the presence of God each day for ourselves and come to church overflowing without lack.